First, could you briefly situate Earth Day in its historical context?
Well, Earth Day took place in 1970, which was, of course, at the end of the 1960s, which in the United States and around much of the world was a time of incredible tumult. Riots in Germany and in France, student rebellions in a great many countries. And in the United States, there was a strong anti-war movement, a strong civil rights movement that had achieved huge victories just a couple of years earlier with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, the beginnings of the women's movement. And amidst all of this stuff, there was this increasing perception that something was going wrong at a fundamental level in the modern industrial state. The era over major cities in the United States then was much like the era over major cities in China and Sao Paulo, Mexico City today. We had rivers that were catching on fire. The Great Lakes were perceived to be dying. A great many bird species were on the verge of extinction due to the use of pesticides. And all of these things came together in people's minds as a sense that the way that we had been measuring progress with growth of the gross domestic product was misleading and maybe even flat out wrong. That even as we were increasing our economic growth, we were diminishing the quality of our lives. So that was the context within which we began to mount this protest against the way that America does business. That first Earth Day in 1970 was purely American.
Earth Day has grown exponentially since 1970. It's now the largest civic observance in the world. More than 1 billion people across 192 countries participate in Earth Day-related activities. How can we harness this power, and why is harnessing it important in 2012?
Well, the power is very different in different countries. In a great many places, the great power is one of changing behavior. And this is often underestimated, but when you look back again in the United States context, at the roots of the civil rights movement, for example, what it was all about was people were told that they could not get served at a particular lunch counter, so they went and sat at that lunch counter and simply stayed there until people decided to serve them or the place closed, and then went back the next day. They were told they had to sit in the back of the bus, they moved to the front of the bus. Told they couldn't go in a swimming pool, they went in the swimming pool. Told they couldn't use a drinking fountain, they went there. And carried it right on to attending schools that had been told that they were unable to attend. If you change your behavior and force the world to accommodate that, then that's a really interesting form of pressure, and one that is very Gandhi-esque in terms of having the means being the ends in the making. Beyond that, in a great many places, and this will differ in different political regimes and different cultures, Earth Day has been an opportunity for major television networks to mount specials, for students to hold teach-ins on college campuses, for large demonstrations to be held that are either enthusiastically endorsing something good like organic agriculture or solar energy, or protesting something that would be highly destructive to the environment. One of the great strengths of Earth Day is that everybody gets to decide what they're going to do. The set of values is pretty clear and it's pretty much universal, but how people tend to respond to that in Shenzhen, China, will be very different than in Caracas or in Miami.
Environmental issues seem to have taken a back seat for world leaders. Why should they focus on environmental issues in these tough economic times?
Well, these days, times always seem to be sort of tough economically. And in tough economic times, leaders often make decisions that they come to regret. They are pushing for short-term growth, sometimes in ways that have lasting negative consequences. In a great many places, for example, they're trying to remove regulatory pressures on the way that one burns coal and other fuels that emit greenhouse gases, in ways that they will then have to reverse a couple of years down the path, often at great expense. There are all kinds of stresses for economic growth at any cost that comes during a difficult time. And I guess at this point we want to let people know that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, and as they make economic choices, they need to be congruent with something that will ultimately produce a sustainable planet.
Can you give me some examples of the kinds of things people do on Earth Day? How can people get involved? What actions do you think will be most impactful?
Well, people get involved in just about every sort of way that you can imagine. For school children, it often involves something that is civic activism. It's going out and picking up trash, going out and planting trees, going out, in the case of older kids, sometimes in insulating houses or working with groups like Habitat for Humanity to increase the environmental standards of buildings that are already under construction. In other cases, people have engaged in large demonstrations. We've had as many as 2 million people in single demonstrations over important environmental issues in the United States. And that's in one location, 2 million people in downtown New York City. And other folks do something that is as quiet as their own family. I have many friends that every Earth Day and or on the weekend surrounding an Earth Day will simply make it a family commitment to something environmental. And they will go out to a national park or a national forest and do something that enhances the environment for other people. It's for those sorts of folks a day of service. A number of places in the United States will find an area, often in a depressed part of some major city, where there is trash that's accumulated in a park, often hypodermic needles and drugs and other kinds of unfortunate things that are littering the ground. And the whole community will turn out, clean up the park, plant some new plants, take a degree of civic ownership in it, and turn it from something that was potentially simply a crime scene ready to happen into a real civic asset.
Do you have a personal favorite Earth Day story?
Well, my personal favorite is probably that first Earth Day when we launched the whole thing. I had no idea whether anybody would participate. In the end, an estimated 20 to 25 million people participated. My role was to get up in the morning, address a sunrise ceremony in the mall in Washington, D.C., fly to New York City and address 1 million people in Central Park, fly off to Chicago and address another huge crowd down in the Loop in Chicago, and fly back to Washington, D.C. that night for the wrap-up on the network television shows. Being very young and utterly exhausted at the beginning of this thing, I'd forgotten to go to a bank the previous day, so I arrived in New York City with about $15 in my pocket, and I had to negotiate the entire remainder of that day, borrowing and squeezing and candidly cheating some taxi drivers out of their full fares and other things to make it through the day. It was an utterly inept performance on my part, but got through it all.
What environmental issues do you think are most pressing today, and which ones do you think need more attention than they get?
Well, there's a whole market basket of issues that are incredibly pressing, including obviously climate change and the mounting world population. It's not so much that we can't feed the people we have, but that we cannot, with the resources of the world, begin to afford 7 to 9 billion people, something that would look like the European standard of living. With any technologies that we currently possess, or any basket of technologies, agriculture itself is rapidly undermining the world's food production systems. So the array of problems is stunning. Those that are getting less attention than they deserve, it's all in the mind of the beholder, but I guess among those that I'd point to are ocean acidification. A great many of the potential, quote-unquote solutions to climate change that involve geoengineering result in just as much carbon dioxide put into the atmosphere, which means that ocean acidification will continue unabated. That's just spectacularly important, particularly for some of the little marine organisms down at the bottom of the food chains. If you care about wildlife, if you look at the wildlife that is in the oceans and measure it just in terms of sheer tonnage, there are more than 10 times as much life in the oceans as there are on the land areas. And by wiping out the bottom of the food chain, we would be producing an unparalleled kind of catastrophe. Other things that leap out there include building sustainable cities that actually are sustainable across the board. They've got great educational systems, low crime, good health care, vitality, opportunities for creativity. We're going to be having the greatest wave of urbanization over the next 25 years in human history. China alone is bringing something like 350 million people out of the countryside into cities. It's like 7 Germanys are being built as cities in China in the next 25 years. And for the most part, although the Chinese are becoming ever more sensitive to environmental issues, the ones that are going up so far are relatively unimpressive. If we can do that right, it's going to be an enormous asset. But if urbanization, which is accelerating around the world today, is done wrong, then we're going to be paying that price for the next 100 years.
Great, thank you.